given the subject matter of our discussions this evening, I think it's all the more important that we are here to deal with these issues in person, because the denial of the 7th of October is Holocaust denial in real time. And it is remarkable, one might think, to observe the inconsistency, the contradiction, even, exhibited by those who both engaged in a celebration of the atrocities in their immediate aftermath, at the same time as engaging in this denial. Atrocities, of course, which were live-streamed around the world, recorded, even sent to family contacts on WhatsApps of the victims who suffered these atrocities. Only yesterday, on the Piers Morgan show, Roger Waters uttered his description: filthy, disgusting lies about women being raped. There is no evidence, he said. Well, that perhaps also reflects the polls indicating that only 9% of Palestinians believe that Hamas committed war crimes, and only 24% of British Muslims believe that Hamas committed murder and rape on the 7th of October. It took some 57 days before the UN condemned the gender-based atrocities and sexual violence, and since then, UN reports, as we will hear, in particular that of the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, have acknowledged atrocities, but not without blaming both sides. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our two panellists to deal with this subject matter. Rosa Freedman is the inaugural Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading. She is a non-practicing barrister and has published extensively on human rights bodies and systems and on UN peacekeeping and accountability for human rights abuses. Freedman is a visiting fellow at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and she is co-editor of the Routledge book series on contemporary anti-Semitism. She has served on, as a member on UN Secretary General's Civil Society Advisory Board, specifically on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, and is a specialist advisor on safeguarding to the UK Government International Development Committee, and she currently sits on the UKFCDO Steering Committee. I'm also extremely privileged to introduce John Ware, who was a staff reporter for the BBC's flagship documentary programme, Panorama, from 1986 until 2012. And today, he makes documentaries as a freelancer. His Panorama last February revealed how Hamas had funded the growth of its military wing into a force almost half the size of the British Army. In 2019, of course, his Panorama on Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party showed how anti-Semitism had markedly increased under his leadership, and following transmission, the Labour Party, the anti-Zionist Jewish Voice for Labour and Paddy French, a Corbyn-supporting journalist, accused John of deliberately misleading viewers, inventing facts, supporting the far right, and engaging in rogue journalism. John sued all three for libel and won.
Thank you very much to UKLFI, to South Africa Shaw for hosting this event and for inviting me to talk on this particularly difficult but important issue. I'll begin by saying that to those of us who work within the UN, it was not surprising that the UN was silent and denied the atrocities on 7th of October. It was not surprising that the UN Secretary General's swift 8-sentence response included a call for Israel not to defend herself and to ask for both sides to just water down the temperature of what was going on. Before Israel had finished counting her dead, the UN very quickly did what it's been doing since 1947 in terms of Israel. And I'm going to provide a little framing of this so that John can get into the specifics of the denialism across the world, and particularly here. I'm not very good at using microphones. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Perfect.
Got to use it.
That's temperamental.
Okay. So, if we think that anti-Semitism is treating Jews as different to all other people. That's the core of anti-Semitism. Then what we see at the UN is also anti-Semitism. It's treating Israel as different to all other countries. It's holding Israel to different standards. It's othering Israel. And it's othering the Jewish people as the only nation in the world not to have the right to exercise self-determination. Self-determination is the core principle of the UN, that all countries, all people have the right to choose who governs over them, the right to their own state, which was the foundation of the decolonization movement. But where we have Israel at the UN, we have othering. And I'm going to give you a brief history of this to lead up to the denialism of 7th of October, so that we can understand that all of us who work within the UN expected and were not surprised by what's happened since 7th of October. As everyone probably in this room knows, in 1947 there was a partition plan created for the British mandate. The British were the trustees of this land, Palestine. It wasn't its own country. The Brits and others were also trustees of other countries in the area, like Lebanon and Iraq. They created this partition plan to have two states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. And over a series of months in the Security Council, the Arab countries at that time, and there were only about 50 countries in the UN, because most countries that we have today were not actually under their own rule, they were part of empires. But the Arab countries who were at the UN stood up time and again in the Security Council and said, we will not accept a Jewish state. We will not accept the land of Israel. The trusteeship ran out in 1948 on the day that we call Yom Ha'atzmaut, the day that Israel declared independence. But it wasn't that the UN had agreed that Israel would become its own state. It's just that the British were desperate to leave. There had been so much fighting. Many of their soldiers had died. They didn't want to rule over this land. And so they left, and Israel declared a state. The Arab countries said they wouldn't recognise that state, and they declared that there was no state of Palestine or Israel, that it all belonged to the Arabs. From that moment onwards, the UN has othered Israel. The countries within the UN have used all of the bodies, and I'll run through them quickly and with some of the key examples, to try and push Israel out of what we call the family of nations, to deny Israel's literal right to exist. The beginning of this was the Zionism is racism agenda that started in the UN in the 1960s. And it started at a time when the Soviet Union had switched sides from supporting Israel to supporting Arabs and the Arabs' right to have a state of Palestine. There had also been a wave of anti-Semitism across Europe in 1959, and the Soviet Union was one country that prominently supported anti-Semitic policies and anti-Zionist policies. In the 1960s, there was a convention, a human rights treaty created on combating and eliminating racial discrimination. And the Americans proposed putting anti-Semitism in there, because that's a form of racial discrimination. The Soviet Union countered and said, well, if you're going to put anti-Semitism in there, we're going to say that Zionism is racial discrimination, and we want to include it in this treaty. That was the very beginning of an agenda that lasted till 1991, and we can still see today in other UN bodies, where for years and years there were resolution after resolution at the UN General Assembly, the place where 193 member states sit. It's like a kind of world government, one might say, calling out Zionism as racism, and then using language that we all hear today, like apartheid and genocide and settler colonialism. This is where the roots come from. Those Zionism is racism resolutions were supported by the African states because they were told that Zionism was like apartheid South Africa. And just like apartheid South Africa was pushed out of the General Assembly, that Israel too should be pushed out of the General Assembly and the Family of Nations. That went on until 1991, and eventually it was rescinded after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they couldn't push that forward. But the bloc of Arab states, firstly in the Arab League and later in what's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which was literally created to try and delegitimize Israel at the UN, has 57 member states, one of which is Russia. It's the only non-Muslim member state. The Arab League and the OIC were also looking to use other UN bodies. First, the Commission of Human Rights, which has now become the Human Rights Council since 2006, to again delegitimize and other Israel. Now, of course, all countries should have their human rights records scrutinized, including Israel. There's no question of that. There are human rights abuses in countries from Sweden to Somalia, and that includes Israel. However, the UN Human Rights Council, as many of you might know, I wrote my PhD on this, has othered Israel to the extent that it has overshadowed the body being able to do any legitimate work on human rights elsewhere. So there is a set standing agenda item, item 7, where Israel is discussed for at least 2 days at every single Human Rights Council session, which is a minimum of 3 sessions a year. And the hope at the time in 2006 was that would confine discussions of Israel to those 2 days. Anyone that's been to the Human Rights Council knows that Israel is discussed across every other agenda item as well. The Human Rights Council can convene special sessions, of which, in its first few years, a third of them were on Israel and the occupied territories in Palestine or in Syria, in the Syrian Golan. The Human Rights Council also creates mandates, special procedures, independent experts to go out and look at human rights abuses. They have a standing commission of inquiry on Israel because they had created so many commissions of inquiry that it was easier just to leave one open-ended so that it could examine human rights abuses in Israel at the same time. Now, people might say Israel commits human rights abuses and it should have its records scrutinized. The problem is that more than 8 million people have been killed in the Congo since 2006, and the Human Rights Council has held 1 special session on the Congo, and double figures on Israel. The problem is that there is a genocide being perpetrated once again in Sudan. We saw it in terms of Darfur 20 years ago, and it's happening again. And the Human Rights Council gives a little bit of time to Sudan, maybe calls a special session, maybe passes a resolution. So the othering of Israel is not about looking at its human rights abuses. It's about this over-scrutiny, this excessive focus, the non-stop attention given to Israel. And it's all part of this same movement to try and delegitimize the country and try and push it out of the family of nations. Now, there are very many examples, and if anyone's really interested, I'll send you things I've written and other people have written about what's happened over the many decades of the UN. But it's not only within the bodies where the member states sit. Many people since 7th of October will have heard of an organisation called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. It was created in 1949 to look after what's called the Palestine refugee. A year later, the UN created the UN's Refugee Agency to look after refugees from every single other country, 192 other countries in the world. The UN Refugee Agency is not allowed to look after the Palestine refugee. The Palestine refugee must fall under this very specific body, UNRWA, and UNRWA itself others Israel, because UNRWA, within its work, says that the Palestinians have a right to return to Israel. No other refugee has that right when they flee. They have a right to claim asylum, they have a right to citizenship and human rights in the country where they resettle, but they don't have a right to return. And when they've asked for a right to return, and this has happened in Ecuador in the 1980s, it's been made very clear to them that countries are sovereign nations, they rule over their own territory, and the UN can't push them to have a right to return. But UNRWA is there to exist in order to perpetuate the conflict and to promise the Palestinians a right to return to a country that didn't even exist, and that now didn't exist in 1947 with the partition plan, and that once they left, Israel created its own rules. Its own rules about who can come into the country and not, and that doesn't include the Palestine refugee. So if we take this othering of Israel within the UN system, within the UN member states who run the UN, within the UN staff members, within the UN independent experts and commission of inquiry, within the UN funds, programs and agencies like UNRWA, it's not surprising that come 7th of October, where a country has been so delegitimized, so othered, so made to be the pariah state of the world, and we have pariah states, right? North Korea. North Korea is the pariah state of the world, the way it treats its own citizens, the nuclear weapons that it tests, the threat that it is to international peace and security and humanity. But Israel has been made the pariah state even worse than North Korea, and it's not happened in a vacuum. The discourse of the language that we hear today and we're challenging has been built up slowly over many decades, long before I was born, and it has been allowed to build up by countries that have said, well, if we just let them discuss Israel now and say these things, maybe we can move on to other issue areas. Countries like Uruguay who say, if we just discuss Israel now, then we can get to the Latin America. They won't challenge what's going on. And it's been driven forward by this large bloc of Arab or Muslim majority states. So we get to 7th of October, and the statements issued were already trying to tell Israel that unlike every other country, she doesn't have the right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. The statements being made within all of these bodies were trying to tell Israel, you cannot go and try and rescue your hostages, because Jews are different to all other people, their hostages have different rights to all other people, and Israel as a nation has different rights or no rights under the UN Charter. UN Women, which is a part of these international civil service like UNRWA's, was silent about sexual violence, was silent about what was happening to the hostages, and we now know from some who have been rescued what was being perpetrated against them, was silent about, as you said, Natasha, the video footage that was being filmed on GoPro cameras of women being raped and abused, and men being raped and abused by Hamas terrorists and their supporters. It took UN Women months to say something, and even when they did, it was fairly anodyne. This isn't limited to the UN. We've seen this with other institutions. We've seen this with countries like Norway that refused to fly the Israel flag. We've seen this with universities that put out a statement, about both sides. Again, this is the other way. Black Lives Matter, if you go and look at what institutions said after the killing of George Floyd, go and look at what institutions said after 9/11 or after Boko Haram kidnapped Nigerian girls, it's never about both sides. It's about expressing solidarity with the victims and survivors. But if the core of anti-Semitism is that Jews are othered, we are different to all other people, and if that core of anti-Semitism is coded into every country, because Jews currently live in 98 of the 193 countries, and we met with Jews from most countries when we wrote a UN report on anti-Semitism in 2019. In every country that Jews live now, they have at some point been persecuted, killed, discriminated against, or thrown out, including this country when we were thrown out of New York, and only allowed back in a few hundred years ago. It's coded into the DNA of every country that Jews are othered. And then we have 193 countries come together at the UN, one of which is a Jewish nation. Of course, anti-Semitism is coded into the UN itself. So, when it comes to denialism, those of us who work in the UN were not at all surprised by the responses. I think what we have been surprised about is how vehemently Jewish people around the world and Israel has risen up and said enough is enough from the United Nations. We will no longer be othered. We will no longer have our victimhood denied. We want to be treated like a member of the family of nations and as individuals like people from all around the world.
Rosa, wow, I'm tremendously grateful for that incredibly powerful overview and scene setting as to our discussion on the United Nations approach to this. John, you're going to speak specifically to the denialism.
Yes.
Are you happy to speak from here? Or would you...
I don't mind. I'm going to have to, because this deals with the detail, I fear I might have a Biden moment, so I'm going to have to stick to the script, everything else my lawyers want me to, so I'm sorry about this. It won't be as free-flowing and as fluent as, well, it might be as fluent, it won't be as free-flowing as Rosa, which was really interesting. So, let me just put my specs on and get going.
While you're doing that, I should say I've had the great privilege of seeing your forthcoming paper, which deals in incredible detail with an awful lot of the evidence that we have, but also with the way that the atrocities were reported. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about when that's coming out, because I'd like the audience to look out for it.
Well, Fathom will be very grateful to you for that, Natasha. Yes, well, I have written a very long essay. I do tend to write rather long pieces, I'm afraid. I'm a sucker for detail, But for those of you interested, there are something like 21,000 words. And they're coming out, I think, on the 17th of July, lawyers permitting and so on and so forth. It'll be published in Fathom, that's the idea anyway. In any event, let me whiz on with some of the detail. You've heard the macro othering. This is specifically about the argument that's going on about whether there was sexual violence and the extent to which, if there was, it took place. But let me get stuck into the detail. One of the most painful aspects of October the 7th for Israelis, and obviously for Jews everywhere, is what's become known as atrocity denialism, the skepticism and sometimes the outright denial that there was a massacre at the Nova Festival, or that women were sexually assaulted, or that hostages had been badly treated. So who are, quote, the denialists, disbelievers, skeptics, whatever word you want to choose? The principal denialists are, of course, Hamas themselves. You may have seen with straight faces, certainly by my count, 5 members of the ruling, well actually it's not so ruling these days, I was going to say the ruling Hamas Politburo. Most of the power really now is within Gaza, held by Yahya Sinwar. But the Politburo, which operates mainly outside of Gaza, they have been on television many times denying straight to camera that there was any targeted killing of women and children and unarmed civilians, and that Hamas did not rape or sexually abuse Israeli women. And then there are the activists here in the UK, passionate advocates of resistance. Several academics, I won't name them all, but I will name Dr. Azam Tamimi. Some of you may be familiar with Mr. Tamimi. He's the founder of something called the Institute of Islamic Political Thought in London. And he once famously bellowed to a London demo, "Today we are all Hamas, today we are all Hamas, today." So I think he said it 3 times. I just didn't get it the first time. He's also the editor-in-chief of a TV station broadcasting out of London to the Arab diaspora called Al-Hiwar, and he told his audience some, I think, 3 weeks after October the 7th, quotes, "Hamas did not target a single Israeli civilian." He said this despite the airways having been dominated for 3 weeks with visual evidence, Hamas's own body cam footage, young people being literally mown down by automatic fire. And for those of you who've seen the footage, and I've seen a lot of it, you can literally see some of these poor devils falling like 9-pins. Now, as editor-in-chief of Al-Hiwar, I think we can be pretty confident that Dr. Tamimi will not have missed the visual evidence, the indisputable, irrefutable visual evidence of Hamas targeting unarmed civilians. Nevertheless, in a lecture to British Muslims, he explained why the idea of Hamas committing atrocities is unthinkable. And I'm quoting again, this is why I need a script. Quote, these words really matter. Quotes, "See, Hamas is a Muslim movement. They train their members on Islamic values before they train them on resistance tactics. And they're told that in warfare, in Islam, you don't ever harm non-combatants. It's haram," which, as most of you probably know, means sinful, forbidden. You just couldn't do this. Now, Tamimi has he has several fellow broadcasters, but one of them is a chap called Dr. Anas Al-Takwiti, who I once happened to give a lift to, actually, before I knew who he was, to the G, whatever it was, summit in Scotland. He was I was going up there with the BBC crew, and he was hanging around, and he asked for a lift, so we gave him one. That's the last friendly interlocution we've had. But anyway, he's actually quite influential amongst activist circles. And he posted on X that allegations of mass slaughter of Israeli civilians on the 7th of October, and again I quote, quotes, "that was a lie too." And he also posted, quotes, "claims of rape by some mainstream media are false, spurious and evil." And he signed this off with a sort of haughty swipe at the Washington Post, who reported Israel's claims of sexual violence, quotes, "try another one." Several other influential activists in this country have made similar denialist claims, including a number of imams. They have no doubt contributed to the poll that Rosa mentioned last March that found only 1 in 4 British Muslims believe Hamas committed murder and rape on the 7th of October. Now, moving to the West Bank and Gaza, so far as these West Bank and Gaza are concerned, 3 authoritative polls conducted in November, February and May by the respected Ramallah-based Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, and it is genuinely respected. If you read their stuff, it's very dispassionate. It's all very fact-based, to be fair. Now, they've consistently shown that over 90% of Palestinians do not regard Hamas as having committed war crimes on the 7th of October. Now, most of those, the poll points out, had not seen videos broadcast by international news media of Hamas murdering civilians. But even when they were shown the videos of this evidence, still 54% of Palestinians didn't regard this conduct as qualifying for atrocity status, as it were. Now, the Israeli government's position is that Hamas and others committed widespread rape. It slightly depends on which member of the government you're speaking to, but the broad swathe of the allegation is that the rape was widespread, that it was systematic. The police, for example, have spoken of dozens having been raped, including, by the way, some men. And I made a panorama a few months ago about Hamas finances, and we did speak to a witness who had been wounded by RPG rocket. She was hid under a tank for hours and hours and hours with a wounded gut. She survived, thank goodness. But she herself says, I've no reason to disbelieve it, that she saw a man being raped. That's her evidence. So it wasn't just women, it was mainly women, but there's other evidence, by the way, corroborating male rape. Now, it is today essentially pro-Palestinian journalists on what I call, and up to others call, alternative media outlets that are now in the forefront of challenging the claim. The main players are American-based. Now, the UK partner in this confederation is called the Electronic Intifada. I don't know how many of you are familiar with them. I would say, judging by, and I've read all of their output, a determination to disprove the case more zealous than even their American partners, much more zealous. They've done double the number of articles on this. Each feeds off the other to an extent. The Electronic Intifada insists that not only was there no mass rape on October 7th, but even quotes, there is no credible evidence of even a single rape. And between them, they charge that the mainstream media, in particular The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Mail, BBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, have been dupes for swallowing, quotes, Zionist propaganda. The Electronic Intifada describes the allegations as the biggest media hoax since the Labour anti-Semitism fabrication. This is the interesting thing. The motivation for this hoax
they all agree it's Israel's way of justifying what they describe as the genocide in Gaza. There's the suggestion that from some that the allegations have been cooked up. I mean, that's the way I read it, for the preeminent purpose of justifying the genocide, and moreover a justification which they argue is easily sold to the wider public because it relies on decades of propaganda, as the electronic intifada put it, quote, Arab men, Muslim men, third world men, black men are inherently wild and dangerous and after our women, and this is exactly what this story is relying on, unquote. So that's the conspiracy they appear to have convinced themselves lies behind Israel's allegations of sexual violence. Now, you may wonder why I should be giving these non-mainstream media outlets, as it were, the time of day, because they're not, they're not mad. Whoops. Okay. This is too. How's that? Okay, well, there you go. So, I mean, this is not New York Times, it's not BBC, these are not mass circulation outlets, but they are pretty influential in their own way. As I said, they don't have the reach of the mainstream media, but their reach is increasing. The reach, by the way, of the mainstream media is diminishing. I know a lot of you won't be fans of the BBC, but believe me, you'd rather the BBC than this lot. And their influence is definitely growing. I think you can be pretty sure that many on the protest march will be getting their ideas from these sort of outlets. Certainly the organisers of the marches will be. And we've seen the impact of their influence, for example, on the more, I don't want to call it mainstream, but anyway, certainly more mainstream, Al Jazeera, major broadcaster, major global broadcaster. They ran a documentary, an hour-long documentary called October the 7th in March. The programme's producer has acknowledged that he, and I'm quoting, relied heavily on several alt media outlets, including Mongui's, Grey Zone and the Electronic Intifada, for their conclusion about, obviously they did their own research too, but for their conclusion on the question of sexual violence, which was that there may have been some rape, but the idea that it was widespread or systematic is, quotes, false. Now, Al Jazeera is very obviously influential, not just in the Middle East, but it broadcasts to the whole world. Hello? I've lost. Oh, it's on again, okay. Gosh, imagine. So, what's at stake here? The heart of the argument, I express a personal view really here, but this troubles me. What's at stake? The heart of the argument over sexual violence is the scale of it, its intensity, the pattern or lack thereof, depending on which side of the argument you're on. Now, there's a lot at stake here, reputationally, for both sides. For Hamas and their supporters, and for Israel. You might say, why does this matter? One rape is bad enough, obviously. And anyway, what about all the horrific atrocities that absolutely can be proved? Are they not bad enough? To be clear, they were indeed horrific, more horrific actually than a lot of people know. For those of us who've seen some of the material that hasn't been broadcast as I have, it's horrific, absolutely horrific. But it matters because the PR war in this enduring conflict matters almost as much as the war itself, as Rosa rightly talked about this pariah status that Israel is accumulating. So if Israel is proved to be correct, that sexual violence was indeed widespread, you can see that the whole idea of Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups as, you know, fighting a sort of noble resistance war does a lot of damage to that, because sexual violence used as a weapon of war is just about the lowest of the low. If, on the other hand, Israel is ultimately shown to have, quotes, exaggerated, if you like, the question of sexual violence, you can be sure that Israel will never hear the end of that from its adversaries, never. And the fact that some of the most horrific claims initially made have been shown not to be true. I mentioned specifically the 40 babies allegedly who were decapitated. That isn't true, and we know that's not true because the Israeli government have published a list of the dead, and there are not 40 babies, thank goodness, who were killed in that way, or in fact 40 babies at all killed. But the significance of this is that the alt media machine, people are relying on these initially uncorroborated stories, which have turned out not to be true, challenging Israel's narrative as further evidence that nothing Israel ever says can ever be believed. That's the importance of that. So when the final chapter, October the 7th, is written, the facts will really matter. So what are the facts to date on sexual violence and its scale? Am I doing all right for time? I'm going on a bit. Okay. So the first point to make about sexual violence in conflict, for those of you who don't know much about this, and I have to say that before October 7th I didn't, Rosa knows a lot more than I do about it, but it's important to understand that gathering evidence to a criminal, certainly to a criminal standard in sexual violence in conflict-related issues is actually quite elusive. Most victims who are raped, murdered, forensic tests aren't done. For the people who survive it, the trauma, the stigma, everything else, it takes a lot to come forward. It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult crime to actually prove, so the evidence is elusive. You might think it's straightforward. It's absolutely not. Earlier this year, the special representative of the UN General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, spent 17 days in Israel reviewing evidence made available by the Israeli authorities, and she brought with her an expert team. I won't go through how expert they were, but they clearly were very expert. Ex-coppers, investigators, open source intelligence people used to dealing with sexual violence and so on. And Pat herself is a UK-trained barrister. Her mission concluded, this is very significant in my view, concluded they had seen, quotes, credible evidence of sexual violence having occurred in, quotes, multiple locations across Gaza periphery, including rape and gang rape in at least 3 locations, with the victims, quotes, then killed or killed while being raped. Now, a separate UN commission with a standing remit by the UN Human Rights Council, which Rosa referred to, currently chaired by Iran. So don't laugh, but paradoxically, this inquiry has, to some extent, has looked at sexual violence, among other things, and to some extent corroborated Patten's findings as it happens. At least in as much as, and again I quote, it, quotes, identified patterns indicative of sexual violence and concluded that these were not isolated incidents, very important that, but perpetrated in similar ways in several locations by Palestinian perpetrators, primarily against Israeli women. But I want to focus on Patten's inquiries because in some respects, they're more significant in my view. Aside from the rapes and gang rape she was satisfied had occurred, her team also found photographs and videos I'm sorry about some of this detail, but the detail matters. She revealed, quotes, a few corpses with conspicuously spread legs. Also revealed a minimum of 20 corpses with partially or fully exposed intimate body parts, such as breasts and genitalia, and at least 10 corpses displaying indications of bound wrists and tied legs. The mission found as a fact there was a pattern of bound, naked or partially naked bodies from the waist down, in some cases tied to structures, including trees and poles along Route 232, which ran alongside the Nova Festival. Now, the denialists, skeptics, disbelievers, whatever you want to call them, believe that little of this is persuasive evidence of actual rape. They question such things as the authenticity of the photographs, because Patton was shown them by Israel. Patton, it should be said, has verified that the material she relied on was authentic. They also, the deniers, argue that there's no forensic evidence. There are really no surprising there's no forensic evidence. The priority was to identify 1,200 people, some of them who had been very badly mutilated, and because of the religious exigencies, swift burial. So there was no forensic. That was the least of the priority on October the 7th. They also say, well, there was no photographs of rape. Well, Hamas, since Hamas assures us that abusing women would be haram, why would the perpetrators film themselves doing something which apparently is so sinful? And then they say there are no credible witnesses. I have to say, going through the witnesses, as I have done very carefully, I don't agree with that at all. I think some of them are very credible. And I think in particular, one of the most important witnesses, a woman called Sapir, I won't go into her evidence, it's too horrific. But suffice to say that the disbelievers have really gone for this woman, Sapir. She saw several rapes and so on. And they've really gone for her, but my understanding what I regard as reliable sources is that Patton found her credible. And the difference is, of course, that Patton has talked to these witnesses in a way that obviously the alternative media people haven't. So, and then finally, they make the point, well, you know, there are no victims. I mean, where are the victims? Why haven't the victims come forward? Well, heaven forbid, have some humanity. I mean, the women who survived, the few women who survived sexual abuse, rape, deeply traumatized. Why would they want to go in front of a TV camera and say, well, I was raped and here's what happened? I mean, really? So none have come forward, it's true. None have come forward. The question is, do they exist? Again, I am absolutely sure that they do exist, and I have something more to say about it. I'm not going to get into the detail now, you can read it in Fathom, but I'm satisfied that more victims, survivor victims, exist than has hitherto been reported. And that is a significant, if I am correct about this, that's really quite significant. Because, putting it crudely, the ratio between if you're raped, you're more likely to have been murdered. So if there's a significant numbers of survivors, it's not unreasonable to suggest that the numbers who actually were raped, talking about the survivors and those who were murdered, is significantly higher. Now that's, I don't have the facts on that, but I do have what I regard as a fact for the number of survivors who are getting therapy currently in Israel. Well, I say, if you want to read Fathom, you'll get the details of that. So, just winding up, Patton has made it clear, just going back to how elusive this evidence is, she's made it clear that actually, getting to the bottom of how prevalent sexual violence is in this particular case is really very difficult and may take, quotes, months or years to emerge. In fact, may never be known. She does, by the way, say that the final result is likely to be much higher, I think what did she say, be clear, will turn out to be even greater than her preliminary findings are, choose my words carefully, than her preliminary findings. So you can take her preliminary findings, I think, as a conservative summary of what her mission found. And if you read it, it is in the language of lawyers. It's precise, it's judicious. It reminds me of a northern former. Joshua's in the audience here, my former BBC colleague. There was a former Lord Chief Justice, Joshua, you might remember, of Northern Ireland, who said the evidence is weighed with a jeweler's scale. Lord Justice Lane, I think. That is the kind of language that Patton has used, in my view. The bottom line here is that this extremely painful issue for Israel, and especially for the victims, and some men, let us not forget, who were sexually abused, will only ultimately be resolved by a full-scale inquiry. And that's a whole new issue fraught with politics, very much the politics of the UN, which I think Rosa is now going to address, because she knows much more about the UN than I do.
John, thank you. I know that's just the tip of the iceberg of everything that you have investigated. But on picking up, and I'll keep my questions extremely short so that we can move to the audience as soon as possible, but just picking up on that idea of a full-scale inquiry, some people have been calling for it at the United Nations. With your experience of the UN, how would you see that potentially working? And given everything that you said in your initial presentation, what would your expectations be if one were to be established?
Thank you, and thank you for that very detailed discussion. I would recommend reading the Fallon piece when it comes out, but reading it when you have time to really digest it. It's not an easy read. The UN is 193 member states, right? That's the bosses of the United Nations. The rest of the UN is there to serve the will of those countries. So the UN General Assembly, where all 193 countries sit, the Human Rights Council, 47 members, and they rotate every year. Security Council has 15. They all can set up a commission of inquiry, a fact-finding mission, an investigative body. And they can appoint independent experts, like the current Commission of Inquiry, which is chaired by Navi Pillay, who's a former High Commissioner for Human Rights from South Africa. It's very unlikely that the member states will get enough support to create a Commission of Inquiry. You can see that the Security Council can't even condemn Hamas for the atrocities on 7th of October in a resolution, let alone call for a Commission of Inquiry into the atrocities that they perpetrated. But there is hope. Because, as you say, Pramila Patton, who was appointed by the Secretary-General as a special representative, is an independent expert. She can choose what she does while she has that mandate, while she's in office under that appointment. There are UN special rapporteurs who are also independent experts. Some of you will have heard of Francesca Albanese. She's a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. But there are other special rapporteurs on thematic issues, freedom of religion or belief, violence against women, that's Reem Al-Sun, you might also have heard of. Special rapporteurs on leprosy, for example. Now, any of them, once they're appointed, can choose what they report on. They have to report within the context of their mandate. There are many mandates and independent experts who could do an investigation. It wouldn't be a criminal investigation, it would be a human rights investigation. But those investigations become part of the international law documents that can be used in courts, right? You can use treaties, you can use custom, but you can also use the writings of experts. That can be academic articles, it can be these types of reports. We've seen a report like this being relied on by the International Criminal Court's office, the prosecutor's office. So those reports are really important. They won't be to a criminal standard. Now, part of that is what you alluded to. You cannot do forensic investigations in a war zone, right? We still are seeing criminal investigations and forensic studies into what happened in Rwanda and Yugoslavia decades ago. It will take a long time for investigations to happen, and it will be after the war, not during it. And as you say, forensic evidence that we know in this country, no war, democratic country, fairly high standards of courts, very few women report in, or men, who've been raped. And even when they do, it's very difficult to establish and secure a prosecution for rape or sexual abuse. The likelihood is that, not for sure, that the UN will not investigate. Because of the politics, and because of the practical difficulties, and because the ICC has picked up on it. And even though the International Criminal Court is not part of the UN, it works very closely. They work, adjacent to one another. But it's just very unlikely that there will be an investigation. If there were to be reports on this, I'd say it's most likely to be complaints made to UN treaty bodies, and particularly to the treaty body that looks at eliminating discrimination against women. But we're talking about years, if not decades, before these are looked into, at which point most of the evidence is gone.
On the ICC, the real difficulty that institution faces is that it does not have jurisdiction. Israel not being a member state of their own statute, and there being significant controversy, to say the least, over the status of Palestine, or the Palestinian Authority's attempted accession to their own statute. It strikes me also, in the context of what you've raised, there have been significant calls within Israel for an internal process to be set up, a series of special tribunals to deal with the volume of atrocities, big questions about whether or not the sexual abuse might be able to factor into that. But it does occur to me that one of the key motivational aspects of those calls is necessarily the distrust of Israel to any investigation launched by the United Nations. The special rapporteurs that you've referred to have a long and established history of reports that are deployable as court documents that get over the hearsay boundaries, say, for example, the hearsay gateways in the UK jurisdiction and the English courts. But the track record of those special rapporteurs being deployed against Israel as opposed to acting within a mandate of impartiality, I think perhaps makes it very unlikely that we'll see Israel engaging or welcoming any investigation along those lines. Could I just pose one question before we open to the audience, and I'd be very interested in both of your takes on this. So much has focused on an analysis of the evidence from the victims, the eyewitnesses, the forensic evidence, which of course to a great extent it does not exist. We've also had testimonies from the perpetrators, and the Shin Bet services have released a number of videos in which Hamas members have acknowledged their own role in sexual violence, in rape specifically. And there has also been some discussion of, on the back of your reference, John, to a pattern of this sexual violence being found by the Patton report, no pun intended, that this has been part and parcel of the intention behind the 7th of October, coupled with the desire to humiliate, the desire to mutilate. And I'm wondering to what extent should we be looking almost from the other direction at the perpetrators and what their motivations and what their acknowledgement and what their motivation may very well have been.
Sure. This whole area is very legitimate questions, and it's not clear. It's absolutely true. There have been 2 or 3, maybe 4. I can't remember. Well, there have certainly been more than half. There have been at least half a dozen perpetrators who have acknowledged targeting civilians, and 1 or 2 have said those were the instructions they got. On the question of rape, certainly if you look at the admissions, they seem to me to be given in a very free-flowing way.
The interrogators aren't getting...
Oh, I see. So the interrogators, obviously fluent Arab speakers in Shin Bet, aren't hectoring them, they're asking very precise questions, and it looks like a very free-flowing discussion. Now, just playing devil's advocate, we don't know whether what went on,
hello?
Hello. So, look, all I can say is that, as a general rule, we in the mainstream media, and certainly in the alt media, and generally speaking lawyers, tend not to rely on admissions because we don't know what possible pressures, offers have taken place in advance of these interrogations. I'm not suggesting that anything is untoward. The answer is I don't know. It's perhaps significant that the Supreme Court has outlawed coercive pressure.
This is the Israeli Supreme Court.
Exactly. Israeli Supreme Court, since I think 1999, has made it, has said that Shin Bet not allowed to use force or torture, certainly, or anything like that, unless there is an imminent risk of death.
The ticking bomb scenario.
Ticking bomb scenario, correct. There are many allegations that has not prevented, interrogations, false confessions. I simply don't know the answer to that. On the question of, but as I say, it's worth looking at the interviews, and you can make up your own mind whether they seem to be free-flowing or not. There are 1 or 2 gentlemen there with blood on their vests, and I imagine that's because they had not a very polite arrest, put it that way. But as to, there was one chap who looked as if he actually was in pain, but again, that might be because he was just arrested. I don't know.
Or detained in a war zone.
Or detained in a war zone, correct. Anyway, so that's that. Now, as to whether this was whether sexual violence was, was a designated weapon of war, was it directed to the Qassam brigades or any of the other armed groups? I honestly don't know. All I can tell you is what I do know, which is that claims that documents, I think initial claims that documents were found containing instructions to that effect, I am told do not exist. That's what I'm told. I don't know whether they do or they don't. Pramila Patton did, there's a footnote in her report which states that I think a claim, there was an early claim saying, here's how to say in Hebrew, pull your pants down, and things of that sort. She said that if that exists, it wasn't shown to us, and we've no evidence that it does exist. Again, I simply do not know.
If I can perhaps assist, because this came up in Toronto actually, quite recently. The Shin Bet was asked, I believe, what their assessment had been of specifically allegations that manuals had been found amongst the kibbutzim in particular, with very detailed information, and whether or not workers in those kibbutzim had been responsible for compiling that intelligence to assist the 7th of October attacks. And their response was essentially that they weren't investigating that because, understandably, it's not within their remit. That, and I think it goes to the very essence of what we're talking about in terms of the denialism, that has certainly been misrepresented by Mehdi Hassan and others as to say what the Shin Bet has disproved or has contradicted, and it's been nothing of the sort. There are many eyewitnesses to have found these manuals. But of course, the widespread perhaps intentional use of this sexual violence is something that has been reported in multiple quarters. Rosa, would you add anything to John's?
I think we have to be really clear about the evidence. Hamas has a charter, and if you haven't read the Hamas charter, and I said this to the Israelis when I was there a couple of weeks ago, if you haven't read it, then you need to. It's available in every language on Google. The charter very clearly expresses genocidal intent. Right? The Charter expresses intent to wipe Israel off the earth, but also to destroy all Jews. That is genocidal intent. Couple that with the acts and atrocities, murder, but also rape. There we have acts of genocide, acts aimed at intended and aimed at destroying a group and whole or in part. Now, the law is made by men from a male perspective. And so the law on violence at a national level or an international level is much easier to prosecute public violence than private violence. It took a long time after international criminal law was created for the courts to recognise that rape isn't just a weapon of war, but can actually be genocidal. There can be intent to destroy a population by preventing women from having more children of that population. Think about the Yazidi women, think about the Bosnian Muslim women. And that rape also can be an intent of genocide because, very often, as you said, women are then murdered after they're raped, or they take their own lives, or they are ostracised from their communities. The rapes and sexual violence that were perpetrated by Hamas on 7th of October were part of a pattern of systematic genocidal acts. Now, whether or not there was a systematic pattern of instruction to please go and rape women is almost irrelevant. Because it's actually a pattern of go and perpetrate genocidal acts against your neighbour, who your charter tells you to go out and destroy every last one of them until they're not hiding behind a tree or behind a rock. So I think we have to think about rape as a weapon of war and a weapon of genocide in this context, as well as thinking about the individual acts and patterns of rape.
That's an interesting point. There's one other point I should add here, actually. Some of the disbelievers, denialists, whatever you want to do, have referred to the fact that, well, it might have been other armed groups, might have been civilians, it wasn't Hamas. As if to say, well, Hamas are the elite, they are the really principal Quranically trained chaps who have a sort of ethical code. Personally, I don't think. Okay, what I want to say is this: in one of the reports, I think it's actually the Pillay Commission report. It's quite interesting. That makes it very clear that the entire training program for October the 7th was run, organised, directed by the Qassam Brigades. It seems to me that given that the Qassam Brigades were in the lead on training and first through the fence and everything else, that it's kind of academic, frankly, whether it was Palestine Jihad or whether it was Qassam Brigades or whether it was anybody. They were running the show. That's the point.
And just very briefly linking it to Rosa's earlier explanation of UNRWA, it's significant that on a proportion basis, the 3,000 that crossed the border and committed those atrocities on the 7th of October, 3/4 of them would have been educated in the UNRWA school system. And I think that is going to be an integral part of the international community processing where it is that this genocidal intent originates.
On another point on that, actually, as it happens, a lawyer I know in Israel has just filed a very substantial case on behalf of quite a number of plaintiffs' families against UNRWA, detailing quite a lot of apparently evidence which I don't think was in the French Foreign Minister's report, wasn't there? There was supposed to be an independent report into Israel's allegations, which basically she said, well, there's not much to see here, I think.
So the report's on UNRWA, and let's be clear, UNRWA has become a brand of Palestinian nationalness. UNRWA runs the road sweeping, the emptying the bins, the schools, everything that the Hamas should do in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority should do in the West Bank. It basically is a state administration in waiting. The report on UNRWA was really about neutrality. Was it upholding the principle of neutrality of the UN? In order for the UN to operate, it can't take political sides. If UNRWA has become the trusted brand of Palestinian nationalists, it's not neutral. And we know that everything starts with education. Now, the education materials in UNRWA are only rivaled by the education materials that used to exist in Saudi Arabia. So let's count in terms of if you've got 5 dead Jews and 3 more, right? Or if a rocket is being propelled towards Gaza, let's learn physics. I don't know enough physics to go through the example. But it's not just the education materials, it's the people teaching. So more than 97% of UNRWA's staff are Palestinians. UNRWA is told it must employ local Hamas staff, so again, very different to every other UN agency. And if you live under a genocidal terrorist regime and you're operating there and you're hearing them drilling tunnels, because let's be clear, drilling tunnels under your school, you're going to hear it, and you're told to please hire this person's brother or this person because they are a member of Hamas, you're not going to turn around and say no. Now, another detail that's really important about UNRWA is that the 3% or less of its staff that are international live in Jordan. They live in Oman. It's not safe for them to live in Gaza. They're not allowed to go there without special permission to the place that they're meant to be serving. It's not, again, to those of us that know UNRWA and understand the UN, it was not surprising that there are allegations. We can't yet say evidence because Israel's not released the evidence because it maybe doesn't want to say how it got that evidence. That UNRWA staff were involved in perpetrating atrocities on 7th of October. The report that you mentioned, and also the report that will come out from the UN's own internal investigative services, almost glosses over that. We need to understand that, yes, 3/4 of them were educated in UNRWA schools, but also that UNRWA staff includes Hamas terrorists.
And the report of UN Watch, specifically on the Telegram chats of the UNRWA teachers, has been, I think, instrumental in raising this on the agenda. Coming to our lovely audience now, we have a couple of roving mics which will find you as and when you have a question, and the gentleman at the back whose hand shot up is going to be first off, and then I think the lady just in front in the colour. So, ladies and gentlemen, now to your questions, and the gentleman just at the back to start off with, if you hang on one moment, a mic will find you. Is there a second?
I'm happy to go without.
Could we bring the second mic over to the lady with her hand raised, if she might? Great, then we'll go straight in. Oh, actually, if you can try, is that mic on? Yes. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Thanks.
Thank you very much all. I think a significant part of this pathology of denialism that we're talking about tonight is, you know, the denial that it is even a terrorist atrocity. And we've seen recently somewhat condescending explainers from the likes of John Simpson and other veteran BBC staff explaining the BBC's intentional not wanting to use the label of terrorism, conveniently overlooking the fact that, you know, they've used that label in articles which are still online today to describe ISIS, the murder of Joe Cox, and the Manchester Arena bombings. somewhat chillingly, straight after that explainer, there was a terrorist attack, you may recall, on the 16th of October in Brussels, and the BBC ran with the headline, 2 Swedes shot dead in Brussels, terror attack, placed directly adjacent to the headline, British is missing after Hamas attack. To what extent do you regard this as a significant part of this pathology of denialism, or just but a minor part of it all?
Just with one eye on the time, I think we might actually take the second question, but I'll ask the panel to deal with them together. We'll get as many in as possible that way.
I assume that's for me, is it? The former BBC chap?
Absolutely. We take the second one and then we'll ask you and Rosa to respond to it.
Thank you very much for your detailed explanation.
A question. Oh, it's gone again. Okay, a question to you both. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
The 45-minute footage that people know about, know it exists, and has been produced and given to a number of people, both journalists and politicians, and UN people that we've all seen, have walked out, some of them have passed out, some of them couldn't walk out. In your opinion, are we now at a point that this needs to be re-edited, reproduced, and distributed? Because at this stage we are struggling to actually explain what happened on October the 7th, and we have that evidence, and it is very clear.
Can I just take a prerogative to add my 2 pence worth, which is that we have seen, even on the 7th of October, footage circulating on social media, and it doesn't seem to have made any difference to the denialists. And in fact, John's reference earlier to the 50% of those canvassed, once they had seen Palestinians, once they had seen those videos that still maintained the content, didn't amount to a definition of atrocity, is just something to bear in mind.
I'm actually thinking about the normal Brit.
Yeah.
I have my faith in Mrs. Smith from Kent. But, you know, that's why I'm thinking. I'm not talking about the
corollary to that is this is never something that Israel has engaged in before. This idea that it would put out images of the dead.
The Israeli authorities respond to that, because you're not the first person, quite obviously, to raise that. And their answer to that is that they have to be mindful, and you can understand why, of relatives and all of that. What I can say is that I've seen the 45 minutes. It's not the worst, I can tell you that. There's quite a lot of stuff that's much worse than that. And you're right, I think it would have a profound impact, not maybe in the West Bank of Gaza, but certainly in the West. But that's the Israeli government's position.
An impact on the BBC, perhaps?
Well, I'm not going to get into that.
In terms of the question that was posed.
In terms of the question that was posed, we were talking about this earlier, sanitising language leads to a change in the discourse. So if you change it from denialist to disbeliever, it changes the impact of it. Now, the BBC...
It's lawyers who dictate that.
The BBC have taken a very clear stance, and they've explained their stance. I'm not a journalist. What I do know is I've appeared many times on the BBC, and I've referred to Hamas as a terrorist organisation, and they have kept bringing me back on again. They have no issue with Hamas being referred to as a terrorist organisation. They're making an active choice not to do so, but they're not censoring other people, and I think that has to be emphasised. Going back to the question about the footage, there are things that when you see them, you can never unsee them, and I think that there are people... Certainly me, I'll talk about me. There are things that I've seen around the world that you can't unsee. I think Israel, but also anyone showing the footage, has a very strong ethical dilemma about the impact of watching that level of horror. I also don't think it changes people's minds. How many decades do we have Holocaust denialism despite photographs and footage and victim and survivor testimony? I think we have to be really careful, and not only about the victims and survivors, but also about the impact on those who view it. And I don't see it being the thing that will change people's minds. Jews have been dehumanized for thousands of years, and the level of dehumanization of Jews has led to people denying that Jews can be victims. There was a clear example in Durban in the World Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia, where Jewish victimhood was denied, that we can be victims. That is playing out in what we're seeing around the denialists, whether people have seen things on social media or whether they've seen the 45 minutes of atrocities in front of their eyes. That has to be changed through education, that has to be changed through discussions, it has to be changed over a long period of time. It won't be changed, I don't think, by 45 minutes.
Let me just say something on the labelling, because I know it's something that does concern a lot of people, and I understand that. So, for the BBC to say Hamas or any organisation is a terrorist organisation is, just bear with me, is a judgment, okay? Let me explain what I mean. Half the BBC major broadcasters, they broadcast the whole world. Half the world don't regard Hamas as terrorists, half the world do. The BBC's position is that these labels are best left to politicians. However, and this is very important, where I think the BBC has become, frankly, and I can say this as a non-staff member now, I think it has become too doctrinaire. Is not even at one stage, I don't know whether they've relaxed it or not, but certainly at the outset on the 7th of October, weren't even allowing the attack on the 7th of October to be described as a terror attack. I mean, if it wasn't designed to terrorize people, I don't know what was. It's also the case that there are, the BBC has not been, and not just the BBC, other mainstream broadcasters have not been consistent about this. The BBC has put the BBC, the distinction that Rosa makes is an important one. The BBC doesn't stop other people saying Hamas is terror. No one says, well, just a minute, you can't say that. Absolutely. It's for the BBC not to put these labels on. That's the distinction. And that has, broadly speaking, applied not just to the BBC, it applied to Sky, it applies to CNN, However, it's interesting that if you follow this stuff really closely, you can see that both CNN and certainly Sky in the early days slipped away from that and didn't flinch when some of their, broadcasters, particularly the chat shows and stuff, referred to Hamas in terms of terrorists. So it's a bit of a mess. But I do think the BBC, myself, has been too doctrinaire over some of this.
More questions. We've got a lady just at the front here, and the whole time. And then, can we start?
Just because the mic's closer to you, the gentleman in the blue
shirt. Sure. Thank you. And then just
if I could just bring the
red light is on. Just go for it, and hopefully it will pick up.
The question I wanted to ask was more about the financial situation of refugees who are funded by UNRWA through UNRWA. In that every generation is now funded, not just the original, the only refugee movement where that it applies to further generations, and the fact that it's actually within the right to return also applying to further generations, and the fact that it's within their interest to keep everybody as a refugee because the input of the funds that come from outside are per capita.
Rosa, could I ask you to pick up on that, and just in relation to some of your remarks earlier, the book, The War of Return, by Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, of course, picks up exactly on these points and makes a very powerful case looking at the history of that organisation.
So UNRWA operates, it's mandated, required to operate in 5 regions: Gaza, West Bank, Syria, Lebanon and Jordan. Any Palestinian that moves elsewhere is no longer a Palestine refugee for the purposes of UNRWA. So if you've got a British Palestinian, an American Palestinian, they don't fall under UNRWA's mandate, only in those 5 regions. Now, the ideal would be that every refugee that comes to any country claiming asylum would receive asylum and citizenship and equal rights. But not every country is party to the Refugee Convention. So the Rohingya, who have been slaughtered in Myanmar, formerly Burma, and are living on the borders of Bangladesh, which is not party to the Refugee Convention, have no rights to resettle, and they are 3rd generation now refugees being looked after by the UN Refugee Agency. So it's not the case that the Palestine refugee is the only refugee population to not be resettled and to have refugee status conferred down the line. The big question is why Jordan, Syria and Lebanon have not resettled the Palestinian refugees. Now in Jordan they're treated much better than in Lebanon, where Palestinian refugees are not allowed to work, to earn money. They're fully reliant on UNRWA, they're fully reliant on handouts. And in Syria, well, it's such a mess anyway at the moment that it's almost, you know, in terms of refugees generally, and in terms of its own war. But the purpose of UNRWA is twofold. It's to create a Palestinian state and to keep the poorest Palestinians, right, the ones who couldn't leave, who couldn't get to America, who couldn't be people smuggled out through the tunnels as they have been done since 7th of October, or out across the border of Rafah if they have people that can pay $5,000 to Egypt to get them out. To keep the poorest Palestine refugees in these 5 areas to ensure that there will be one day a Palestinian state. Now, I'm a believer that a 2-state solution is the only solution, but we're further away from it than ever now. But this idea of the right of return is not a right to return to Tel Aviv or to any other place that's within Israel, even if the grandparents were born there. It's a right to return to the Palestinian state when that one day is created. And UNRWA fails to tell that to the Palestine refugee. They say to them, you will return to where your ancestors came from. Under international law, Israel has no obligation to take these people back in, and it just simply won't happen. So the politics of this is to promise the Palestine refugees something that is not within UNRWA's power or the UN or international law's power to promise them, and to perpetuate then the cycles of conflict, because even with the Oslo Accords, where almost everything was offered, this idea of the right of return to Tel Aviv or to Ma'alot or to any other places that would be within Israel's borders was not within the power of the Oslo Accords to offer. So peace is pushed further away by UNRWA making these promises.
Including because it's a euphemism for the destruction of Israel.
Well, yes, including that also. And in terms of funding of UNRWA, it's really interesting which countries do fund it heavily, because they're not the countries that were meant to. UNRWA was created for a few years until the Arab countries would take over and pay and resettle these refugees and also pay for the relief and works agencies and humanitarian services that all refugees and displaced persons need. They never took over that funding, and they turn around to the UN and say, you created this problem, and so you have to keep funding it and keep having UNRWA in place. Now, we've been working a lot with various parliaments and on public record speaking at them about what to do about UNRWA. One suggestion that I put forward, and I hope will get taken up by these parliaments, is to turn UNRWA into a hub, a regional hub for refugees from everywhere in the region. Yazidis, Syrians, whomever it might be, Iraqis, Kurds, so that it no longer focuses on the Palestine refugee and just becomes a part of the UN dealing with refugees generally. There are other things being tabled, but certainly what we know is that UNRWA cannot continue in the form that it is the day after the war ends.
I'll take 2 final questions and then I think we'll have to call time. There's a link just here. Yep, in the discussion. And then a gentleman will be next.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Right, first of all I wanted to just, if I may, just respond to one thing you said. I actually firmly believe that the reason that Iran are investigating on behalf of Israel is to further their own claims that Israeli soldiers have actually perpetrated sexual atrocities on Gazans. But that wasn't my question. We all know that education is key, and it's the only answer to any of these questions. How do we educate the world into realising that there are mainstream media channels, and I'm sort of including Al Jazeera as a mainstream channel. Now, this is a very simplistic question because I know it requires a much broader answer than we have time for, but Al Jazeera are known on the quiet to say to people in the media and journalists that they know that there are lies occurring with regards to Israel and that they cannot comment because of the way they're being funded. How do we make them accountable? How do we bring this to the public's attention? Yes.
On a similar note in relation to the previous comments on BBC, isn't the greater issue we have that the BBC and Sky and CNN and all the other mainstream media outlets uncritically report what Hamas say is going on without any regard to the fact there's no independent journalism possible within Gaza and without actually questioning what those stats on their face say. I wake up every morning screaming at Radio 4. I never switch over to LBC because at least the DJs are honest in terms of their stance. But just one example, every day you hear the war dead from Gaza, and every day we'll say, well, what about Hamas fighters within that? How many of those are Hamas fighters? How many of those are civilians? And so it speaks to anti-Semitism within the BBC, and that for me is a greater issue than the alternative media or whether or not the BBC officially calls Hamas a terrorist organisation. It's that issue.
The division, of course, between civilians and combatants, which isn't provided in those figures, but also, very importantly, how they are alleged to have died. Because we know Hamas are killing their own. We know that their rockets, when they fall short in the Gaza Strip, kill indiscriminately. All of that information is missing, and we've done actually a very important previous webinar with analysis on some of the inconsistencies, internal inconsistencies, and noted fabrications within those totals. So those two questions. John, would you like to?
I don't think, look, you know, I spend very little time on the BBC these days, you know, I don't make many programs for them. I don't think the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic at all, okay? I think there are quite serious problems within the Arabic service, but aside from that, you may be frustrated with the BBC. It's quite difficult reporting conflicts, actually. It's quite difficult to really discover quickly what's true and what isn't. You need to make some allowance for that. I appreciate how frustrating it may be, but in the real world, that's how it works. There are pockets of, I think, ignorance within the BBC, where there shouldn't be. There are certainly instances of, you know, indifference to the sensibilities of the Jewish community. But I do not think there is an anti-Semitic problem within the BBC. I'm sorry if that.
But Al Jazeera?
Well, I can't get into, for reasons which I can't get into, my views about Al Jazeera.
I'll take those Al Jazeera, so that's fine. Qatar is the younger sibling in the relationship in the Gulf states, and it doesn't matter how much money you've got, if your older sibling is cooler and stronger and better looking than you, you're going to feel a little bit inferior. Al Jazeera is part of the soft power of Qatar. And we know that soft power is important. We know that China is deeply jealous of McDonald's and all the other things that America has of soft power, and has gone around African countries building pavements and banks and everything else with Chinese symbols on, not out of the goodness of its heart, but to create soft power and more and better feeling towards China than America. This is a big part of how geopolitics plays out at a national and local level. Al Jazeera does some phenomenal reporting from countries and about countries that no one seems to report on, whether it's Bolivia and Peru, or whether it's Mali, or all sorts of countries. And it has built up this soft power for its position within the Gulf states and on the world stage. And in many ways it's played an absolute blinder, because when it came to 7th of October, it had built up tens of millions, if not billions, of viewers who trust it because it goes around and reports on children being sent down mines in Congo. And then it can perpetrate and spew out lies and propaganda, and people will believe it. Now, I don't think there's a quick fix to that. Let's remember that Jews are 0.2% of the world's population, 15 million out of 8 billion people. We can talk to one another, we can talk to other people, but we're not going to have our voices heard because we are a tiny minority. So my answer is, let's play the long game and start with universities. If we think about who runs the media, who runs schools, who runs banks, who runs politics, it's people that go to universities. And the long game is this: the discourse and narratives at universities on Israel and Palestine will inform the next layer of politicians and journalists and everything else. We need to address what's going on campuses, and I don't just mean encampments and protests, I mean what goes on in the classrooms, what goes on in academic journals, what goes on in conferences and in funding bids and the billions of pounds given to projects and everything else. We saw in America, and I'll try to be brief on this, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the left-wing Marxist economists, which you find at every university, and the far left were looking for anyone to pair up with that would take on the big bad Americans, capitalist Westerns. And my enemy's enemy is my friend. They joined with the radical Islamists in Iran to overthrow the Shah, and was very soon crushed after the revolution because the radical Islamists didn't want left-wing progressives. But in America, this started as a fringe movement in the 1980s and 1990s, and we're seeing today what the result of that is, not just in the universities, but in everyone who has gone to university, and what the discourses and the narratives are. Language really matters, and when you hear over and over again that Israel's an apartheid state, if you don't care about Israel or Palestine, it seeps in somewhere. And then you go off to work and you see something about Israel, and you've heard Israel as an apartheid state over and over again. You've not looked into it because you cared more about what was going on in El Salvador when you were at university, but it's there. So we have to address the root cause of this if we want to address what's going on in the media, in the next generation, and the policymakers and politicians and everything else.
I note also on that your earlier reference to the Saudi textbooks that have dramatically improved, and I hope that that is an indicator, at least of some of the players in the region, that are absolutely taking on board what you and our questioner have highlighted, that education here is at the core. Ladies and gentlemen, I am phenomenally grateful to Rosa and John, having the input of a legally trained academic with immense experience at the United Nations, machinations, and a journalist of your experience and expertise and investigative ability, I think has provided our audience with a phenomenal insight on a subject where I think the real analysis and investigation and interrogation of this is only just beginning. We are going to see denialism increase, and we're going to see the debates about what happened on the 7th of October, I fear, become more and more divided. But with this input and this experience, and importantly, the Fathom article, which is forthcoming, which I encourage everyone to engage with. All 21,000 words of it. Does that include the footnotes? Because they're expensive. There will be very much more ink spilled, but I think we'll all be in a better position to digest it on the back of this discussion. So thank you very much for